Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being here. We hope you enjoy this event. I'm Mike Harris. I'm the owner of FCC Consulting, specializing in data technology solutions for anti-financial crime. I'm joined by our guests, who I'll introduce to you shortly. And our webinar today is hosted by Kyckr, who are global registry data specialists, and pleased to say with Alloy, leaders in automated KYC onboarding processes. And we'll hear a little bit from both of them shortly. So our theme today is widening the lens, a practical guide to KYC, KYB automation for AML and fraud prevention. We hear a lot of talk on these themes continuously, and particularly around the convergence of AML and fraud prevention. So we'll touch on some of those themes as we go through today. And we all know the challenges in relation to anti-money laundering and fraud, increased regulation and pressure from the regulators, growing criminal sophistication, an extensive use of digital, and ever more complex business structures. And all of these are leading to increased costs, increased pressure on customer experience, and managing ever-changing levels of financial crime risk. So there's an awful lot that firms have to contend with. And in the fight against this is the pressure to remain competitive. And it's essential to deliver a frictionless onboarding and continuous monitoring in a way that doesn't increase the cost to the business. And many of these things seem to be competing tensions. So we'll try and work our way through them as we go along. But what are the best-in-class organizations doing today? And how are they mitigating this throughout their KYC and KYB processes? So let's find out. Let me welcome our panel of industry experts. I'm pleased to be joined today by Edwina Johnson from Alloy and Steve Lamb from Kyckr. And between us, we're going to aim to discuss some of these key themes on this topic. Now, just a little bit of housekeeping. There's, if you'd like to ask a question, please just post it in the question box on your screen, and we will see them as you post them, so we can take them as we go along, depending on their context, if it's something we're talking about specifically, or we can obviously leave it to the Q&A session, which we'll have at the end. But we'd like this to be interactive, so please do post your comments, your questions, your thoughts as we go along. It's always good to share the experience of the audience that we're speaking with. So before we start, I'd like to ask each of our panel members just to say a little bit about themselves and the work they do. And Edwina, if I can start with you, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Edwina. I head up global expansion for Alloy. And Alloy is an end-to-end identity risk management system for financial services companies. So started in the States and now expanding out internationally.
Great. Edwina. Steve.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, I'm Steve Lamb. I'm Chief Operating Officer at Kyckr. Kyckr is a business verification provider. As Mike said, we've built a network of real-time corporate registry connections. So we help financial institutions primarily with legally authoritative verification at the onboarding stage, both for AML and fraud prevention.
Great, thank you, Steve. So, right, let's dive into our first question panel. And it's this. If one of the main responsibilities when it comes to AML compliance and fraud prevention is actually to prevent financial crime, what do we think could be done? What more could be done to prevent that? So let's just open that up with a few thoughts about some of the challenges that everyone faces in fighting financial crime. So Edwina, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, so when I think about the responsibilities for this, I think about where this sits within the organization. And Alloy did a fraud report earlier in the year where we spoke to 250 folks across financial institutions and asked them about the fraud they were suffering, and found that fraud is massively on the rise and that there's so much cost to organizations. But we also asked about who's responsible for this, where does it sit, and what is the pain of fraud you're incurring. And unsurprisingly, the responsibility doesn't just sit in one or two teams, it's really across the organization. So I think the majority of firms that we spoke to had over 50% of their employees working on fraud. And that was people from compliance departments, fraud departments, through to product, through to the exec level within an organization. So huge range and assortment of people involved. And that's really because that cost of fraud is so multifaceted. It's really impacting different areas of the business. And we found that folks who aren't in the C-suite often just think about fraud as the direct financial hit when that money's stolen from the business. But if you go up and talk to people at the C-suite level, then they're thinking about all sorts of things, and they will look at reputational damage and the loss of good customers as more important fraud hits. So what this kind of boils down to is making sure that you really understand the fraud within the organization and categorizing that properly, and then knowing which tools or how to tackle the fraud that has been experienced.
So you're suggesting there, Edwina, that the responsibility lies across the organisation, and organisations need to understand that financial crime risk, whether it's fraud or money laundering, isn't just the responsibility of the few people that sit in compliance. It's a business-wide responsibility.
And maybe that's a perception, but knowing that over 50% of employees are touching some kind of fraud-related project or activity just shows the breadth of this problem and where folks can intervene and support.
Yeah, sure. Okay, Steve, would you like to sort of build on that?
Yeah, let me start by echoing one of Edwina's first points, that I think it is very much a C-suite responsibility and needs to be increasingly recognised as so. We've talked on a few panels recently about the need for compliance generally, fraud AML as part of that, to go from a box ticking exercise to something that's realised as a key business pillar, really, both in terms of risk reduction and growth, which I think we're going to talk about more. I think there does need to be that C-suite representation and focus. Interestingly, saw yesterday an interview on Bloomberg with Barclays CEO CS, where he identified KYC as a specific focus of the organisation, and I'd like to see more of that. It talked about as a central activity, both in terms of the bottom line impact, but also for ESG reasons as well. And yeah, I think it is increasingly becoming a priority for more divisions in the organisation to collaborate with each other to root out fraud and financial crime. I mean, let's face it, to start with, risk and compliance account for a substantial part of the organisation in most financial institutions. In 2020, I think Citibank disclosed that 15% of its employees were categorised as risk and compliance. I'd have expected that to go up quite substantially since then. There's another report that said risk and compliance hiring was up 99% between 2021 and 2022. Now, I'm not sure that's a good thing, because it implies that financial crime is on the increase, which it is, but it does show that this is, there is an organisational commitment there, and there needs to be representation at the strategy level if that headcount accounts for such a large part of your organisation. And I'd probably finish by saying Edwina and I were both at the Money 2020 conference last month, or earlier this month. And one of the big topics there was about the convergence of fraud prevention and financial crime. And actually we heard from Laura, one of Alloy's co-founders, at an event, talking about how fraud is often a precursor to financial crime, so it makes sense for them to be linked. So I think in an industry that I found loves its acronyms, the one you're going to hear probably more of at the moment is this FRAML. And actually thinking about how fraud prevention and AML teams can work together and actually combine data sets to root out some of those risk models and do better analysis with the customer data they've got.
I really love FRAML. Yeah, I think FRAML is great because, as you said, Steve, earlier, that AML or compliance is sometimes just seen as a checkbox and something that needs to get done in order to do the main business. And then fraud is sometimes separated out and seen as this business cost and something that you need attention and expertise on. But fraud, so many of the technologies and the signals and the events that kind of indicate fraud are just, I said, a build up to money laundering or potential larger issues that are happening. And that could be monitoring a device signal or onboarding that prevents money mules, which in turn prevents money laundering. So it all kind of should be linked and is linked together.
So we're talking in an ideal world. Sorry, Steve, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you asked what more could be done, Mike, and Edwina and I focused very much on the organisation to start with as well. But I think it has to be said that companies are only one part of a trifecta for me, which is the companies, regulators, and governments. And we're seeing companies doing lots more and investing in services like Kyckr and Alloy, and looking at how they transform their processes. We've seen regulator action. To get controversial for a second, I think the one thing we're not seeing enough of is government action and implementing proper support and proper legislation to help with these processes at organisations. The big example for me when it comes to Kyckr's area of work, KYB and business verification, is access to UBO data. We were promised in the EU with the fourth and fifth AMLD that there would be public access to beneficial ownership data. In concert with an obligation on entities to verify that data within the onboarding process. What we've seen as of last November is a radical climb down, really, off the back of the ECJ judgment, which has seen access to that data restricted. So it's all well and good, regulators upping fines and increasing sanctions, companies paying more attention on it, but there needs to be the proper legislative environment as well to help these companies do more.
Good point, Steve, and that's a nice segue into what's about to happen, which we've been talking about for an awful long time, which is the governance around Companies House data. And we have the the Economic Crime Bill, the Corporate Transparency Act, progressing through Parliament at the moment. I think it's in the House of Lords at its third reading stage. But this will bring an additional requirement into the whole financial crime compliance ecosystem, if we get to the point, and hopefully we will, where there's better governance around the data. Just want to sort of ask you both your thoughts on what might ensue in terms of, we have to do identity checks on directors and people that are nominated, as part of a corporate structure when it's registered. And I think there'll be a sweeping up exercise that will go on, no doubt, over a period of time of existing businesses. So do we think that kind of measure is going to make a difference? And what additional work might it add into compliance for, identity checks and so forth? Who'd like to start on that one?
Maybe I'll start on that one. So yes, I think it's a positive step. I think the Economic Crime Bill, taken at face value, implements some much needed new processes in terms of the way Companies House is managed. My issue is more that I'm not sure it goes far enough. I'm not sure it addresses some of the core challenges with how our system is run and the data is processed. And the world, governments are deeply conflicted. I'm quite conflicted as well, because I want a competitive business environment in the UK. But at the same time, I'm constantly questioning whether we and whether other countries have got that balance right between privacy, between the competitive environment, and between corporate transparency and actually rooting out financial crime. I'm so boring and nerdy that I actually read the report stage of the Economic Crime Bill this week. So it's not a page turner, let me tell you, within the House of Lords. And there was a quote in there, I forget the Lord who brought this up, that said, Conservative Lord, the UK's transparency when it comes to shareholder data and UBOs is the envy of the world. And we've made, fantastic steps. And, I slightly struggled with that a little bit. I think that there's an element of truth in that we were one of the first to act on that back in 2015 or whenever it was. But by the same token, I regularly log on to Companies House and see, a 14-year-old identified as a company's UBO, or even worse, a company identified as a company's UBO, which kind of defeats the whole point of the exercise. So I think it's a step in the right direction. For me, it doesn't go far enough. The geopolitical context with the economic situation is whether they will, attempt to bring in more controls, which may restrict the setting up of businesses. Sadly, I'm not so sure.
Edwina?
Yeah, Steve, I do appreciate how nerdy you are. I've not read the full details, so you can have more on that than me. But yeah, generally, widely reported about Companies House being a real factor in key fraud trends, like very unique to the UK, like pig butchering, which is very exciting. So I'm glad that is being tightened up, and I think that's really good that they're investing that and changing that. And And then, as Steve said, yes, we've done good stuff. I think we can observe and learn from other countries and how they're managing UBO data as well. There needs to be some friction in there. You need to be able to trust the data that you're seeing, but you also don't want to slow down businesses operating or put too much friction on that side in there.
Yeah, let's return to that. It's a very good theme, because this concept of the frictionless customer journey is an interesting one, but we'll come back to that in a moment, because I think it's an aspiration that is very difficult to actually achieve in practice, but obviously it's something we want to get towards. So let's just start talking a little bit about compliance. We've talked a lot about the external factors. We've talked about some of the internal challenges. We've talked about fraud and anti-money laundering. I think anti-money laundering in particular has suffered with a poor image. It's been an area historically that's been seen as that back office department with the responsibility for ensuring we meet the regulations. I think one of you mentioned just now the tick box mentality, which is an overused phrase, but it's something that we clearly still have, in many ways, as a mindset, as a culture in many organizations. And yet, when we talked about this in preparation, we talked about how we can move to where AML is seen in a much more positive context for the business as a competitive advantage. Let's unpack that a little bit. Edwina, I know this is something that's close to your heart. Would you like to sort of expand on it a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think it can be a competitive advantage. And I think it does come back to the friction point around good friction, bad friction for your end customer experience. So folks that are managing their compliance better, if they're getting the right data sets in, if they're doing it in a seamless fashion, if you're kind of feeling really confident about the information that you're bringing into compliance decisions that you're making, have a really great way of reducing false positives and making decisions faster, and then actually reducing some of that kind of friction that your customers are seemingly interacting with as well. And we know there's a study that's been produced that says 50% of consumers who abandoned an online application form for a financial product did so because the process was frustrating. So actually, if you can improve that customer experience, but also reduce the fraud, and also make sure you're hitting your compliance requirements, and you can give folks a better experience when they're signing up, then you're going to get more people onto your products. You're going to get higher usage rates, and that's just going to be a win for your business.
Absolutely. I always give my personal testimony here of opening a business account, one with a fintech and one with a traditional red brick physical bank, without naming names, of course, but the experience was vastly different. The speed and efficiency with which my fintech business account was opened versus the lengthy, frictionful, if that's a word, process that I experienced on the other hand was in marked contrast. And yet I was left with a feeling from a compliance perspective, which was the more thorough, albeit it was too slow, because there is a sense that we can be too fast onboarding. And Steve, businesses are getting more complex, and certainly, you're an expert in business onboarding. What can firms do to manage these journeys, these customer journeys, when they're dealing with really complex organizations that are having to onboard and do the correct due diligence processes, which aren't easy?
Yeah, I think it's that point about the right kind of friction is exactly right. Yes, we should be striving for better customer experience, but not at the expense of compliance. And I've always said that it's kind of like a seesaw, and you see, maybe more kind of 4 or 5 years ago, you would see these challenger banks come along. You can open an account in seconds, one by one, again, without naming names. You would see them get, fined or called out in the press for having poor AML controls. So it definitely is right to strike that balance. And people are thinking about it a lot. I remember talking recently to a product manager launching an SME lending product. It was in POC stage, and he said, "Look, we want an offer out straight away, via an online form, and we want the money in our client's account within 24 hours." And they were experiencing 15 to 20% drop off because of the fact that they just couldn't do that business UBO verification quick enough. So that for them was, that the sole factor in determining that, a 20% revenue bump. So what can they do? I mean, it kind of moves into the challenge of KYB generally, which you're right, is Kyckr's sole focus, which is that it's still a nascent field. There's a very established process to doing KYC and the types of ID verification you need to do. But even core business verification, core business details, there's no universal standard for data. The information at corporate registries is often of different levels of comprehensiveness, different standards in how the data is presented. Hence why we are focused on normalizing that and enriching it into a single data flow. And that's before you get to UBOs. Whereas, again, without dwelling on it, you've got an obligation to verify them. But where do you get the data from? So we are working on a product at the moment that helps automate the process of unwrapping those corporate ownership structures. But I can tell you, with some of the existing manual processes, speaking to some of our banking clients, that process can take 4, 5, 6 hours of an analyst's time if you're talking a particularly complex structure. So what the solution is, there are services out there, ours being one. Alloy have lots of tools to support that, but it's knowing what the requirements are, the regulatory requirements, knowing what the possible solutions are, and then marrying the two together and getting that balance right between speed of onboarding, but also making sure you hit the required marks when it comes to compliance.
Absolutely. You touched on a point there about, the cost of getting it wrong, because there's no doubt I've read two reports this week. I'm sure our audience have seen the same statistics, but in the last 12 months, UK banks got to find a total of, I think, something like $220 million for breaches of regulatory breaches of various kinds. These are eye-watering numbers. I think HMRC, as a supervisor, as a regulator of some of the financial services sectors, issued a report saying that in the money services business or business sector, I think it might be slightly broader than that, they fined something like 240 firms, a total of £3.2 million. So the regulators are baring their teeth, which suggests that a regulated entity, a firm, has got to get this right. So best practice needs to be in place to ensure that we don't miss our obligations. And we'll return to the theme of technology in a moment, but I'm still keen to sort of unpack this thought about how we can get the right mindset into the organisation that AML compliance in particular needs to be brought to the centre. At a practical level, what would your tips be from what you see? You both work across multiple businesses. You see good and bad. And Edwina, would you like just to share some of your experience in this? What have you seen where you think, wow, that's really working well?
Yeah. Yes. When we think about KYB, the come back to the point of the UBOs, there's always an element of KYC involved in it as well. So you're looking at who the people are behind the business and trying to verify them and understand who they are. And that kind of talks to Alloy's broader outlook, which is whenever you're managing risk and fraud, it always ultimately comes down to the people behind that activity and behind what's happening. And if you can identify people and understand the people, then you can better understand the risk. So that's why we think it's important to have a view of risk throughout the life cycle of your end customer and the people behind that. So that's combining insights, not at the point of onboarding, and then through different activity or events that happen within the customer's life cycle, which could be transactions or behavioral data, and kind of pulling all that information together to get a much better understanding of the risk activity in real time.
And within that, you talked about workflow structure, the importance of workflow structure, the importance of having a consistent way of dealing and managing the onboarding process. That's something that, best practice will come to that towards the end. But in terms of, what are the good firms doing? Well, obviously, there's lots of elements that need to be brought into play. But one of them is ensuring that you have a consistent, repeatable process. And it seems to me, Steve, you talk about this. It's getting people engaged in the obligations, the compliance across the business. We touched on at the beginning, but I think this is something that is so important.
Yeah, I'm pleased to see, actually, looking at the attendee list, a mix of KYC compliance leads watching this, but also product managers. And I think that's a really important point, is that this is a technical challenge as much as it is a compliance challenge, because it's all about how do you automate. You could have a watertight onboarding process, and you could pour people at it, but it might take 3 months to onboard a customer. So, but boil it down, it's about how do you automate what's a very manual process at the moment in a way that maintains, standards around compliance. Because the risk with automation is even if you take 10% of a human out of the equation, that's 10% less eyes on the process and less eyes on the data. So to go back to your initial question, how do you start to frame it and frame the mindset more about an opportunity rather than a challenge? Well, I think it's always about taking it away from fear of loss, which can be a great motivator for organizations, but more to opportunity for gain. And you do that by focusing on what are the improvements we can make in terms of efficiency, and in terms of customer experience. So I love it when we get clients come to us and they want to know about business verification, but on the call are their CTO, their product manager, their head of KYC, and MLRO. So that relationship is crucial, and I think you see in some of the larger institutions, there's program managers that have a remit for KYC, AML transformation being appointed. I really support that because I think it requires multiple teams working on it and focusing on what are the wider organizational goals.
No, very good point, Steve. Thank you.
I would definitely agree with that as well, Steve, where you can have a product owner involved, and quite often, those are the folks that are coming to Alloy as well and saying, what's the upside that we can get by improving this process for our end customer and the product experience. And then it does become that competitive advantage. So we were talking about earlier.
Okay, let's turn our attention to another set of words we hear frequently, which is all about the risk-based approach, which suggests that not all entities that we're onboarding at any one time have equal risk, which of course we know. But let's talk about some of the challenges that go with that. What are the benefits, what are the challenges associated, for example, with introducing perpetual KYC? Do we need to be doing perpetual KYC on all of our clients or just some of them? What are the factors that are determining and telling us that we need to be doing more due diligence, not less? And that transcends the onboarding and through the entire relationship. Edwina, would you like to talk about this whole idea of perpetual KYC?
Yeah, perpetual KYC. And I feel like perpetual KYB is even more new and up and coming as well as a term. But it is, as you said, it's moving from, go back to the checkbox of like, yes, we need to make a risk assessment. Yes, we need to check that this risk assessment is still correct. Let's just put a random time on that check to happen again, and actually saying, what is the data that we're getting in on a regular basis? How can we use that data? How can we stitch all that data together? How can we look at it in a dynamic fashion and have that data updating? And then set certain criteria or boundaries around the original risk assessment that we made on this customer. And when that data changes and we compare it to the original risk assessment, then it triggers certain flags or certain activity that we then need to go and take. And it's being able to look at the whole life cycle of the customer and monitor the risk in real time, and pin it to different events like PII changes or funding an account or moving money around, and think about it, taking it back to the person underneath, and see all of that data in a much more kind of comprehensive and useful view versus one-off random checks on people.
Absolutely. Steve.
Yeah, I have to say I have worried at points in the last few years that perpetual KYB, let's call it specifically, is this kind of utopian vision that we may never get to, and that spend a lot of time talking about it with organisations, but are we really on the track to getting there as an industry? And I think ultimately it's because it's an operational challenge, maybe less so a data and technology challenge. So we have a perpetual KYB solution. We deliver event-driven alerts for changes in businesses, and we have some clients that benefit from that. But often when we're talking to organisations, it's, well, what would we do with the alerts? We struggle at the moment, with all to handle the volume of information we have on our clients. You add another load of information that we need to verify, we need to check, we need to interpret and derive the insight. That's going to cause a huge amount of pain. One of those clients I mentioned, we deliver 15,000 alerts per month, in terms of organizational changes of the businesses we're monitoring. So it's about how do you actually take the insight from that data and interpret that in the right way. And I've got a hope and suspicion, and it's like lots of things in the world at the moment, not all, lots of them not related to what we're talking about, that AI and ML could have a part to play in this, and actually that is a task, interpreting and deriving insight from huge volumes of data that AI is very well equipped to handle. And I think we're already seeing this specifically in transaction monitoring. So I attended a talk at Money 2020 with the Dutch bank Bunk and a consultancy they'd worked with. And they said they were using a rules-based approach. They were getting about 95% false positives on their transaction monitoring previously. Again, somebody's got to look at those, and that's wasted time. And they've massively, massively got that down by proper implementation of a machine learning approach. That's not easy. You've got to have the expertise to be able to do that, and the money to do that as well. It's not cheap. But I think that is the end game for me. Is I think the data is there. We can deliver event-driven alerts. Being able to know what to do with that and actually implement that into your process is key. And in the meantime, I think that to your point about risk-based approach, for me, risk-based approach is, it would be ideal if we were monitoring all of our customers all of the time. Is that realistic? No. And what we've got to do at the moment is try and take a best efforts approach that is in line with the risk appetite of the organisation and what is mandated by law as well. So we have customers that will monitor, look for event-driven alerts on a quarterly basis if they're high risk, maybe it's an annual basis if they're lower risk. And I think that's a good stepping stone then to get to a point where actually, and again, it may be a slightly utopian vision, but we should shoot for the stars. We can get to that point of having a consistent knowledge of what the risk level is of our customers.
Thank you, Steve. I think we're constantly trying to balance three tensions, and we've touched on these already, but we're trying to balance the fact, and again, you both brought out the fact that compliance as an industry has been a growth industry, employing more people. And certainly recent research shows that quite clearly. LexisNexis produced some research earlier this year that showed that the total cost of financial crime compliance in the UK was in the billions. I can't remember the exact figure, but we're talking something like £30 billion, huge numbers being spent on compliance. So you've got the need to get that under control. So you've got the efficiency objective where we're trying to do all the talk with that. Actual KYC seems to be adding potentially to that cost rather than subtracting from it. You've got the effectiveness challenge, which is how good are we at actually identifying early identification of financial crime, fraud, and dealing with it before it gets into the system. And then the third one, which we talked about at the very beginning, which I think is a very important one, is the customer demand. What do our customers want and the customer needs? So we're trying to balance those three things. So that's, if you like, leads us into the next part of our discussion, which is best in practice technology. How are firms dealing with this? If we're moving from a culture where we just add more people into the equation and we say, well, actually, we can't keep doing that. We have to be smarter and better and use AI and machine learning and technology to deal with some of these challenges. Where are you seeing best practice moving now? And what would you say from your experience to our audience are the things that they should be thinking about in their technology journeys? Edwina, I'd like to start with you on that one.
Yeah, sure. So, best practice, why are we doing this? We're trying to remove the friction from the process and get more confident in the decisions we're making. How can we do this with technologies? There's so many different new and emerging fraud and identity technologies that are coming out in the market. One of those things has led to a lot of point solutions and quite linear decision making or siloed decision making. So what I'd like to see from folks is taking advantage of the different solutions out there, but doing it in a way that is combined for smarter decision making, and not making decisions in silo. So not making a single decision at onboarding and then forgetting that decision and not referencing it later on, and bringing kind of a more holistic view of your customer to that process and using the data within there. And then Steve, that talks to your point about like we have all this data that we can surface on events or on things that are happening, but again using the events, tying it to the profile, thinking about how you can trigger activity or alerts that are based on risk, based on the type of event, the profile of the person underneath that activity, and the kind of risk level of the product that they're interacting with as well. And if you do that, then you can increase approval rates, you can reduce fraud, and you can reduce your false positives as well. So it's a kind of an end win.
Right. So Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, those of you listening in that have bought technology in this space, I feel for you massively, right? Because we would put the number based on our own research at maybe definitely in the hundreds, possibly north of 400 vendors that claim to do something, probably in many cases claim to do the same thing, in this space. And where do you go? How do you start to navigate that world? And there's a good point there, which is that it's an opportunity. It's a space that is ripe for automation, and you've got lots of entrepreneurs and founders piling in to help solve this challenge, which I absolutely love. But as a buyer, you've got to be able to navigate that and understand what's better to buy, what's better to build, what's better to partner. And I think it's on the vendors. We've got a responsibility to collaborate and move beyond point solutions to that whole solution type approach to get a bit theoretical. So Kyckr's in partnership with Alloy. That's been a hugely successful partnership for us, because we each have strengths that complements the others, areas where we're not focusing. So it's collaboration, and that ecosystem approach that I think is key. And what more can the practitioners themselves do? I think really understanding what your requirements are is crucial, and knowing what you want to achieve. It's not enough to say we want to automate our onboarding process. That's what we want to do. Let's go and find a vendor that can help us do that, because you're just going to be swimming in a sea of marketing language. But if you can identify the parts of the process that you do want to automate and look for vendors that have got similar case studies of working with your organization, you're going to narrow that down considerably. But yeah, generally, I think there's some really interesting technology. Just to finish off, what Alloy are doing. I think there's no code decisioning platforms that are fantastic because they take a lot of the complexity out of constructing that process. I love that. I think, again, the elephant in the room, AI, those that are using that to help kind of revolutionize transaction monitoring and other parts of the process that use large volumes of data, I think are really interesting as well. And then, as you'd expect, I think ensuring quality data, what Kyckr's doing, and other providers, let's be clear, around ensuring there's quality data that goes into the process, as small a part of that is, I think that's crucial as well.
So we've got three elements there. We've got people, obviously. We need people still to be running these processes who have got the right skill sets, the right background, training, etc. And there's some transitioning going on in the industry there as we automate some of the processes that have been traditionally done, let's say, by people. And we found that those can be automated to improve the quality and consistency of results. Technology, and then the layer of data. So you have to bring these three things in. So if you're thinking about this as a regulated firm, and you've touched on this, Steve, you're looking out into a big landscape of potential solution providers. It's like looking into the forest to find a single tree. You want to find that tree. What would your advice be as to where do you start? Where do you start with this? Particularly if you're a smaller firm, and you've had a legacy system that you've been using in your onboarding processes for some time, and you say we recognize we need to adapt, we need to transform, but you've got to make a start somewhere. Where are you going to start? Where are the real opportunities for automation?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of finding the right solutions with early stage tech, which is what a lot of this is. I mean, some of these companies are large, but it's still pretty early days in terms of the overall automation of fraud prevention. A lot of it's about referrals and about seeing proper case studies of organisations solving this challenge for regulated entities. So there's this marketing fog, right? And there's loads of stuff online, and there's great information you can find. But at its core, I'd encourage everyone in this space to regularly be talking to, colleagues insofar as you're permitted to with regards to privacy, but and sharing ideas about best practice and best vendors in the space. We love it when we get referrals from our customers, because it means they're talking to each other and sharing best practice. And I think that's the way to find solutions and find interesting providers and interesting ideas of other organisations, is to be collaborating and talking more with your peers.
Good points, Edwina.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Talking to folks who are doing, seen as best in practice in terms of how they operate, how they're looking at fraud, how they're looking at compliance, how they're looking at automating decisions and finding out how they're doing it, who they're using. Being able to use a system where you can bring in a new technology and test it and look at the kind of uplift or the change in results that you're getting. And then I really, from Alloy's point of view, really big fan obviously of orchestration, because you can pull in new data and analyze it in a centralized way, and you can move away from making kind of linear decisions from one solution to another, but actually pull all the data out and look at it in a smarter way. And that really does have a huge impact in the end results that you're going to get.
It's a term I frequently hear, is orchestration, and I'm sure our audience is saying, would you like just to explain what orchestration actually means, so that we've all got that common understanding of it, Edwina? This would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think there's definitely confusion around aggregation and orchestration. As the aggregation is bringing in, different data points together and having one place to get access to that data. Orchestration gives you the ability to pull out the data that you want to use and make decisions across different platforms and across different decisions. So it moves away from being linear, but kind of just pulling the data out, making smarter decisions on it in a way that you get to control as the end customer as well.
Okay. I'm going to give you both a wish list. So Edwina, you can think about your wish list. If you could wish for 3 things that could make a huge difference in this whole field, what would they be? And Steve, you're a data specialist. You're someone that knows the KYB space really well. You've talked about some of the challenges that firms face. We all have, as a regulated entity, the challenge of identifying the UBO, which always sounds easy, but it's difficult. And data is hard to come by in many cases. If your wish list could have however many things you want on it, but 3 things you could say, we need to do this better, what would that be? What would they be?
Specifically for Kyckr space, I think a lot of it at the moment is around that getting to the UBO. Right? That is the primary pain point. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's tough to get the data together and get that aggregated, enriched, and then plugged into your orchestration platform. But we're serving lots of clients to help them with that transformation. But the bit that is the challenge is around this UBO verification, and I think it's not. I think organisations are doing enough. The ones that I speak to, I have no recommendations, in terms of ways that they could work internally to better improve that process and make it more efficient. I think it's on vendors and technology providers to look at ways to innovatively address that challenge. They could be internal, don't have to be external. And I think it's on governments. Again, I think there is this central tension at the moment between corporate privacy, well, it's individual privacy really, to echo Edwina's point, that it's all about people, not necessarily businesses, versus corporate transparency. And that tension is going to continue to bubble on, and it's going to need some degree of gradual resolution at some point. Or if it's not, there needs to be a conversation again about the obligations these firms have got. I think that's the key thing for me, is that the perspective of regulated entities often doesn't get represented strongly enough in some of these discussions. But this is great for society. We'll force all these processes onto the banks, and that will help cut, financial crime. But it also creates massive costs, right, for them, for their customers, for society as a whole. So, unless you're supporting them with that, and that's what, why I hope greater corporate transparency would do, putting aside the moral and ethical reasons why I support that. So yeah, I think that I'd struggle to come up with the spot with a couple more. I think that is probably our big one at the moment.
That's absolutely fine, Steve. And I wasn't really expecting that to be ticked off one at a time. But there's certainly things that we would all like to see done better, obviously, and improved. And I was thinking particularly, when I look around the world, and you guys are experts at extracting corporate registry data for a long time, the variability of that data, the lack of standardization of data remains a big challenge, because as we know, we talk about companies, as you mentioned it early on, the comment you saw in the House of Lords on the economic crime bill, comment that was made there that somehow we have this gold standard, if you like, and yet the inconsistency of availability of data around the world, to me, remains a huge challenge. And the fact that so much more of it has gone out of public access, out of public domain, and gone behind closed doors makes our jobs much, much harder.
I think a lot of people aren't aware of that challenge as well. And it's our job as a business to educate them, and that's why we do activities like this. I watched a panel recently with 3 up-and-coming payments and SME lending firms on it. And at the end of this panel, it was about broadly the differences between B2C and B2B payments. But the moderator turned to the panel and said, look, what's your biggest operational challenge? Broad question. One by one, they went through and said business verification. And the first person on the panel stood up and said, look, I've been in this job a couple of months. I had no idea until I joined this job that there's no central company registry. Every country has their own registry. And not only that, but these registries are, different levels of quality. They have different data sets. There's no UBO, there's no shareholder data at lots of them. Baffling. So I totally agree. It remains a big challenge when it comes to KYB, and it's often a misunderstood one. I think people have a higher expectation of law enforcement and government than is the reality, sadly.
Yeah, absolutely. I've often used the phrase that people expect there to be a magic button that you put the name in, you press the button, and the answer you want comes out the other end. And sadly, we work in a very grey world where the variability of data across the globe makes that extremely difficult to do, not just in KYB, but most areas. Let me come to your wish list, Edwina. What would you like to see? What do you need from your experience?
When you asked me this, I jotted down the first thing was standardized and accessible data and organizations and UBOs. So that ties very nicely in, and why we love partnering with Kyckr. So that's a big kind of friction point in the industry. And then going back to our point around thinking about how compliance and AML can be more of a competitive advantage, and how and kind of viewing both of those as being much more interlinked with fraud management. And thinking about the impact on the organization, the impact on your customers, the impact on your reputation, and how they all tie together. And then linking data, linking events, linking risk profiles, and taking it back to the person underneath the activity that's happening, and not just looking at a transaction in a silo.
Yeah, vastly improved data analytics is crucial in fighting financial crime, and we need the technology base to be able to do that, to automate it, to identify patterns and do the things that help humans understand the risk typologies that they're looking at. As we draw to a close, I'd just like to say, if anybody has got any additional comments or questions, please do drop them in the chat box, the questions box, and we'll deal with them. I'd like to return to this acronym that you gave me at the very beginning, FRAML. Now, this is all about fraud and AML convergence. Now, I believe from recent research I read that there's beginning to be a move in the industry towards this, but what do we think needs to be done at a practical level? What do firms need to be thinking about to actually achieve an improvement in the convergence between their obligations on the one hand of AML and the challenge they've got in dealing with ever increasing amounts of fraud, which aren't regulated? Let's face it, that's not a regulated entity. That's just a business challenge of bad people basically taking advantage of the weaknesses in our organizations to and our customers to basically defraud them. So how do we manage to merge these two things better? What could we do? What could we suggest that our audience starts thinking about if they're not on that journey already? Who'd like to start?
That's a biggie.
It's a biggie, yeah.
Where's McKinsey consultants when you need them? I think again, it's that intersection between data, people, and technology. Again, always for me. So data in the sense that these, if there's two separate teams, they'll often have different pools of customer data. You'd think they'd be shared. We're talking big organisations here. Data's rarely shared across team boundaries, and there's a technological challenge in doing that. So that kind of brings in that element. And then the people element, at a senior management level, it's exactly what you just said, Mike. It's recognizing that there are linkages between these two things, and that by combining them, I'm not talking, merging two teams, but better collaboration between those divisions, that actually that both of their objectives can be achieved more effectively. And that's still, it's still a relatively new concept. Like we said, if I contrast my experience at Money 2020 last year to this year, there was significantly more talk about it now, which means that it's a very nascent subject. But I think that there needs to be that realization that they are linked, and then starting to do something about it in terms of how we shape the organisation.
Absolutely. How about you, Edwina?
Agreed. Yeah, agreed. Getting teams talking to each other, sharing of data. Other things to add to that, I think the typologies of fraud have often remained the same over many years, but the way that they get executed differs slightly in different environments or different social settings. So trying to think about, like, going back to the original typologies of fraud, thinking about how new technologies or new data can be able to identify those or intervene with those, and then thinking about, when you break down typologies of fraud, when you break down different types of fraud that exist, first party, third party, synthetic, money mules, whatever kind of fraud that you're looking to prevent coming through the system, just thinking about how that actually builds into money laundering and what are the tactics that money laundering are going to be using. And actually you can see this whole connected web of activity underneath.
Absolutely. Just drawing on my own experience in that end, I was involved in a workshop where we were talking about this very subject with a small number of financial institutions, and asking this question: what are you doing to leverage the teams you have managing fraud and the teams you have managing money laundering? And those that I thought were really tackling this issue recognized that the skill set needed at a people level was very similar. So, you need the same sort of challenging, inquisitive mind, understanding of financial crime typologies, what's going on, and being able to actually put that into practice operationally. And what they were doing was embarking on cross-training of teams so that they had the ability to flex their workforce. So businesses ebb and flow, and fraud and AML ebb and flow. So they recognized that cross-training was a very good way of improving the ability to deal with that and creating a better understanding of how, as you said, Edwina, fraud and money laundering kind of like go hand in hand. I mean, fraud becomes money laundering. The proceeds of fraud need to be laundered. So obviously they find their way into the system in other ways. Right, so we're coming up on time. I'd like to sort of just ask you both for your, going back to our theme, which was widening the lens, a practical guide to KYC, KYB automation for AML and fraud prevention. And if I may, I'd just like you to ask each of you to give a summary of what your sort of distilled thoughts would be on this topic to our audience. And if you can, draw out a few practical tips that you can give to people to take away. Who'd like to kick off on that one? Steve, I'm looking at you on my screen, so I'm going to say, would you have the first word? Yeah,
so the first three words of that title, widening the lens, that sums it up for me, really. The key here, and has been for a number of years, is going from, I'll try to avoid the cliche of box ticking, but an exercise in meeting regulatory requirements to something that is seen as a core organizational responsibility that has, financial, ESG, stakeholder impacts, far beyond just complying with a piece of legislation.
Yeah.
So that sums it up to me, and that's a responsibility of everybody working in this space to work towards that future. I think we've talked a lot about the kind of practical elements of how to do that, but the solution for me is through technology, right? It's again, that I'll return to my kind of seesaw between compliance and customer experience. The way you perfectly balance that is an effective, technology approach.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Your summary would be, Edwina?
Yeah, I very much agree with Steve. Find out how technology can give your end customers a better experience and think about it from that competitive angle, how it's going to make you more money, as well as preventing fraud and the cost of fraud. But using latest technologies, latest data, bring it together, decide how you want to use that data, thinking about it throughout the customer's life cycle, and that will be hugely beneficial to your end customer and resulting ROIs and revenues.
Right at this moment, I have a helicopter right overhead where my office is based, so I'm hoping that the sound of that is not drowning out this sound overall. But it's one of those moments. I think it's just moving away right now. So annoyingly, thank you, Edwina. Look, I think we're coming up on our time now. We've covered an awful lot of ground in this hour of discussion. Just to answer a point, the recording of this webinar will be made available to everybody that signed up for it. So yes, you'll receive a copy of this. It's been a fascinating discussion. I think we've got something which I would describe as a work in progress. We're far from the finished article. We're all on a journey. I think there's a collective desire to do well, to do better. I think we understand that KYB is a challenge. It's a huge challenge for everybody, but there are technologies, there are data suppliers, there are sources of information that can improve existing processes. And I think, firms would be advised to start looking at how they're going to look at their whole process holistically, but not to try and boil the ocean. That would be my one point, because it's always tempting to try and do too much too soon. But pick an area of the business, look at where there's low-hanging fruit, to use a phrase, or there's an opportunity to make a big improvement, and start there. And certainly the technology and the data of our two panelists today can certainly help in that journey. So a quick plug for Alloy and a quick plug for Kyckr. And to thank you both indeed for your contributions this morning, and to thank the audience for joining us. And we hope that we've provided some food for thought and some interesting ideas for you to think about further. So on that note, I will thank you all. Thank you, Kyckr. Thank you, Alloy, and say goodbye.
Thanks, Michael.